With us as we went through the votes, etc. I welcome everyone to the committee and welcome to the meeting number 27, the House Commons Standing Committee on Government Operations and Estimates. The committee is meeting today to hear from the Parliamentary Budget Officer regarding his report on Parliamentary Budget Officer's report on Canada's military expenditure. For the last 30 minutes of the meeting, we will be able to go in camera to discuss committee business. Today's meeting is taking place in the hybrid format pursuant to House Order of November 25, 2021. Members are attending in person in the room and remotely using the Zoom application. Regarding the speaking list, the committee clerk and I will do our best to maintain the consolidated order of speaking for all members who are participating virtually or in person. I'd like to take this opportunity to remind all participants to this meeting that screenshots or taking photos of your screen is not permitted. Given the ongoing pandemic situation in light of the recommendation of the public health authorities, as well as directive of the Board of Internal Economy on October 19, 2021, to remain healthy and safe, the following is recommended. As we're all aware, we have a hand sanitizer at the front of the room when you come in. Please use that, and in your seats, recognize that we have mechanisms to wipe down your mics, your seats, and your tables. At all times, you're asked to wear masks when circulating around the room. And maintaining a distance during that time. As Chair, I will be enforcing these measures for the duration of the meeting, and I thank members in advance for their cooperation. I'd like to welcome Mr. Giroux back to committee, and good to see you again, sir, and thank you very much for agreeing to attend and bearing with us during this last little hour delay. You have 5 minutes to make an opening statement.
Merci, Monsieur le Président, Mesdames et...
Thank you, Mr. Chair, Vice Chairs and members of the committee. Thank you for the invitation to appear before you today. We're pleased to be here today to present the findings of a report entitled Canada's Military Expenditure and the NATO 2% Spending Target, which was published on June 9th. With me today, I have the lead advisor analyst on the report, Christopher Penny. Consistent with the PBO's legislated mandate, my office prepared an independent forecast of the military expenditures needed for Canada to meet the North Atlantic Treaty Organization's 2% defense spending target for the period of 2022-23 to 2026-27.
Remarks in English. In 2006, NATO members agreed to the policy goal of setting their annual defense spending to at least 2% of GDP. This target includes, in addition to national defense spending, expenditures on veterans' pensions and benefits, as well as Coast Guard, among others. We estimate that total Government of Canada military expenditures will increase from $36.3 billion in the 2022-23 fiscal year to approximately $51 billion in 2026-27. The corresponding increase in the share of military expenditures to GDP is from 1.33% in 2022-23 to 1.59% in 26-27. In order for military expenditures to reach 2% of GDP, the Government of Canada would need to spend an additional $75.3 billion over the next 5 years. Chris and I would be pleased to respond to any questions you may have regarding this report or other PBO work. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Giroux. And I will go now to questions, and we'll start with Mr. McCauley.
Thanks, Chair. Mr. Giroux, Mr. Penny, thanks for joining us again. Appreciate report. What year was it that the government changed how it formulates or calculates the 2% or the defense spending? I understand it was a change over pensions.
That would be in 2017, fiscal year ending 2017.
Okay. And this report shows 2017 forward on the new numbers, but previous is under the old numbers?
That's correct.
Okay. Would we be able to get similar report with the old numbers? What would be required to have that happen?
We could put forth an information request to National Defence to have that breakdown to see if there's any difference in the calculation between 2015, 2016, and then the discontinuous break in 2017.
Okay. You can probably imagine what I'm leading to. Do you require a committee motion to access those numbers from D&D? Or would they be readily available otherwise?
It would probably be easier to have a motion from the committee. They could be readily available otherwise, but it certainly facilitates our work to have a motion to back up a request for information.
Okay. Chair, I'm going to introduce a matter of hand motion. This is one I was mentioning, Mr. Johari, and I'll read it into the record, and I'll do it now, and I'll use up my time for the motion. That the committee requests that the Office of the PBO update Chart 2.1 and 2.2 in its June 2022 report titled Canada's Military Expenditure and NATO 2% Spending Target to reflect the reporting standard used prior to 2017, and the update be provided to the committee by September 15th, 2022. This is just to get an apples-to-apples comparison of the spending so we have a better idea.
Thank you, Mr. McCauley. Do you have that electronically that you can?
I just have it in paper.
Okay.
But Paul had it electronically. I have it in French as well.
Okay. Thank you. We'll circulate that and as quick as we can.
Yeah, it's a pretty straightforward motion. Just solely update two of the tables in the information to reflect pre-2017, so 2016, 2015, 2014. So we have an apples-to-apples comparison, so we can see increase or decrease.
Thank you. And with that, we will go to, you're done, Mr. McCauley?
Yeah, if we can,
Okay.
if we can settle that, I'll just finish up my time.
Okay.
If my colleagues would agree or if have any feedback on it.
Do we?
Do we need a vote on this, or is that satisfactory?
One. So if we have agreement, then we don't need a debate on it. Is there agreement around the room I'm seeing around the room, yes? It doesn't have to be unanimous? Sorry, Mr. Johns, if you would, you have your hand up.
Just always appreciate the motion being read back to us if we could.
Certainly. Could we read the motion again so he can hear it again? And Mr. Johns, the clerk will also send it out right away as well, but if you would read it back so he can hear it.
Sure. The committee requests the PBO update Chart 2-1 and 2-2 in the report that we're studying now to reflect reporting standard used prior to 2017, and that we have it by 3 months from now, I think September 15th, just before we return.
Thank you. Mr. Johns, did you have anything further? Thumbs up? Okay, I'm seeing thumbs up around the room. Ms. Vignola? Yes, we're looking just to see if you're okay. Carried then. Carried. You have 2 minutes and 30 seconds.
Gentlemen, how does the NORAD announcement yesterday affect going forward numbers? Does it make significant, or had you already considered some of these numbers in your report?
After seeing the announcement yesterday, we inquired with the public service as to whether these numbers were included in the budget announcement, and they were already included in budget 2022. So yesterday's announcement with respect to NORAD does not change the numbers in our report, as we already included budget 2022 expenditures in our report.
Great. And last question, inflation, generally what we've heard over the last several years with this committee is procurement inflation for Naval, Air Force, et cetera, is generally running double current inflation. Are those numbers still holding, that we're seeing the current inflation 6.8 if we're expecting almost 14% inflation with our procurement?
Well, the
And
impact,
I realize it's tough going forward 10 years, 20 years, but
well, the impact of inflation is twofold. On the one hand, it reduces the real impact of the amounts that the government is budgeting for national defense. So it reduces the purchasing power of the amounts that are established by the government to D&D. On the other hand, inflation increases the GDP, so it makes it more difficult for the government to reach the 2% target under NATO. So it has a double impact in that sense.
okay.
I don't know if that answers your question.
It does in a bit. I understand, you've got the denominator changing as well as
Yeah.
the other side. I'm just curious if you, in your forecasting, if you are keeping the general 2-for-1 inflation, procurement inflation over regular inflation.
It's difficult to know beforehand what the impact would be of this economy-wide inflation regime we've now entered would be on defense-specific inflation. But thus far, we've assumed that the defense-specific inflation would increase along with the economy-wide inflation, not as a function of it, but increasing along with it.
Yeah. Is it easy to update this report when the updated SSC numbers come out, or updated for ship costs and that?
Yeah, it should be straightforward.
Okay, wonderful. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you.
Thanks, gentlemen.
We'll now go to Mr. Housefather for 6 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the Parliamentary Budget Officer for being here. Mr. Giroux, I just want to ask a question related to the previous motion that Mr. McCauley
Wait a moment,
just
Mr.
put forward.
Housefather, we can't hear you.
Oh, that's strange. One sec.
Just bear with us for a second there, Ms.
There's no sound.
Oh, there's no sound in the room.
I'm hearing it. Maybe we can.
Oh, we'll just go to headset then.
I could hear him.
I'll just
Can
go
you
to
hear me
headset
now?
Yeah, there's none in the room, just on the headset.
Oh, okay.
Okay, let's try
I'll
that
just put-
again.
I'll
Mr.
just put-
Housefather, if you would start again, please. Thank you.
Sure. Mr. Speaker, can you hear me now? Mr. Chair, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, thank you so much, sir. Mr. Giroux, great to have you with us today. And I just wanted to come back to the motion that Mr. McCauley just put forward. He had talked about in 2017 that Canada had changed the way that we calculate the way, defense spending, what is in defense spending to, I guess the idea was that because we did it that way, we were including new costs into defense spending that previously weren't there, which might artificially increase the percentage of GDP we're spending on defense. Can you clarify whether that was a Canadian government decision or whether that is a NATO decision that allowed us to do that, and now that is being done throughout NATO?
The changes that were introduced in 2017 allowed governments, including the Canadian government, to include veterans' benefits and pensions for consideration to reach the 2% target of NATO. So it's an application that Canada made to NATO, seeking to include that, and whether it would be accepted by NATO, it was. And other countries are also doing the same. They include veterans' benefits and pensions in the calculation of their defense spending for the purpose of the NATO definition.
So again, basically, this was a decision by NATO to allow this, and countries across NATO, when we're looking at the different numbers that you've come up with to show us the percentage of GDP that different NATO allies are spending, we're comparing apples to apples because all countries could do this if they want, correct?
That is indeed my understanding, yes.
Perfect. I wanted to go to a different question. As you know, with the purchase of 88 new jets, with the national shipbuilding strategy, with the new NORAD, announcement yesterday, we're suddenly in the midst of managing a number of large, complex procurement projects that require significant capital investments all at once. This is significantly more than we've seen in the last couple of decades. What are some of the complications that you have noticed in your studies that arise from undertaking multiple large and complex procurements consecutively? And if you could share perhaps some of the lessons you've learned by doing your reports on this.
That's an interesting question. So we did a report in March, I think, or maybe later than that, on capital spending under the strong, secure, and engaged defense policy. And we looked at the planned spending, especially on the capital side, in 2017-18 compared to the most recent expenditures, actual expenditures. And we find that the pace at which the Department of National Defense has spent was lower than initially planned, which has resulted in a reprofiling of these expenditures of about $10 billion, if I'm not mistaken, over the first 4 years of the defense policy. So the government or the Department of National Defense was behind schedule in these expenditures, which resulted in a reprofiling of these expenditures to later in the period. And that's probably as a result of challenges resulting from the procurement process and delays that the Department of National Defense encountered in procuring these major acquisition programs or launching these major acquisition programs. So one can only speculate that with additional or new equipment being purchased, as you referred to, the fighter jets and the surface combatants, notably, there could be further delays, but it's hard to predict at this time whether there will be additional spending delays in spending these amounts. So we have taken the Department of National Spending profile going forward at face value. We did not adjust further what the Department of National Defense submitted to us for the purpose of this report.
OK, compris. Et je veux juste...
I'd like to look at the issue of increasing expenditure funding. What I see is if I looked at this NATO program in 2015, we spent about 1.01% of our GDP on defense. Now it's 1.36. In your projection of spending $75,000 by 26-27, we will be spending approximately 1.3 or 1.59% of GDP. What are the expenditures that you envision will be easier to increase? Would it be on equipment? What do you think would be the best way if we want to get to this, if we want to get to this NATO 2% target? This is an issue that the Department of National Defense and professionals in supply will be better able to answer than I am, because we have to look at the speed with which we can acquire this equipment or recruit personnel. But if the operational needs of the forces are considered, including that of Veterans Affairs, there's also the Coast Guard, and they are all included in this 2% objective for NATO expenditures based on GDP. So you can't offer us any advice at all? No, unfortunately, I'm not the best person who can provide you with an answer. It'd be best be directed to defense. Thank.
To Mrs. Vignola for 6 minutes.
Thank you very much. Mr. Giroux, in your report, and Mr. Penny, who is here as well, in your report, 1.13, you say that these measures can change from those declared by the government. You also say that this is based on data published by StatsCan to determine Canada's participation rate. My first question, what are these calculations based on, which cover two governments, to deal with these expenditures as part of its... I know that NATO uses one thing. What does the government of Canada use? They use the statistics provided by Statistics Canada. Same data. So the stats should correspond. Yes. The question may look simplistic, but when we talk about either a Coast Guard ship or a defense ship for the Navy, are the costs included for the calculations made for defense spending? Yes, absolutely. So it's not just the construction, it's the whole range of the whole process. Yes, operating costs, etc. Thank you. Previously, you said that the calculation method was changed in 2017. Veterans benefits have been added, and that's new in the way that you make these calculations. This morning, we heard the report on survivors' benefits. Is that included in the calculations as well, or is that something that's outside of the way that you calculate these costs? That's also included in our calculations for defense spending, according to the NATO definition. And despite these amounts, it's not enough. So it hasn't really changed the percentage that much. No, because we're talking 2% of GDP. GDP, well, that's about $200 billion. So we're talking about tens of millions of dollars in order to reach this rate. So even if we add a few $100 million to this, we still have quite a significant shortfall that we have to meet. We have seen what's happened in the past. The Department of Defense was not able to spend the amounts that it was allocated. In your opinion, why is it that the department doesn't manage to spend these amounts? Because clearly, and this is not a political question that I'm asking, the department knows that our soldiers don't have the proper equipment. Why? How do you explain the fact that they can't spend this money? It's hard to give a clear answer without doing an in-depth verification. The Auditor General might be able to provide a better response to that question. However, the Department of National Defense has said itself in planning its expenditures and with the approval of Cabinet, they've said that the individual who does the planning has a very good idea of what's going to be spent. So we can ask whether the audit has been done properly, and if there is a gap in the expenditures compared to the plan, questions need to be had, particularly if there's no significant event that occurs and nothing extraordinary happens that upsets all of the planning. They need to improve their planning, but as I said, the defense officials and the Auditor General will probably be able to provide you with a more clear, explicit answer. Thank you. Sometimes in the newspapers or in our email box, we receive petitions asking Canada to stop selling weapons to countries, for example, certain types of tanks. But the government, well, are there any Canadian companies that specialize in these armored vehicles? Are these companies doing this? And is that included in defense spending, or is it in the GDP spending? Purchases by other countries of Canadian goods are not accounted for in Canadian defense spending. As you said, this contributes to the GDP. And it also contributes to the NATO 2% target. So if there's other obligations that have to be considered as well. The National Shipbuilding Strategy has had its budget increased, not significantly, but it has gone up. What impact has this had in our ability to reach this 2% target? The expenditures for the shipbuilding strategy, if it's for the Coast Guard or the Navy, when these expenditures go up, if the global envelope for defense is increased in a commensurate way, this increases. However, if the national shipbuilding expenditures strategy reduces the expenditures in other sectors, that's accounted for. So thank you.
Mr. Johns for 6 minutes.
Well, it's an honor to be joining you today from the homelands of the Nuu-chah-nulth people on the unceded lands of the Huiputsáset and Sashat on today, National Indigenous Peoples Day. And I'd like to also give a huge shout out to all First Nations, Inuit and Métis people on this important day. Mr. Giroux, on a per capita basis, how much would Canada need to spend in 2022-23 to meet the NATO 2% target?
I haven't done the calculation precisely, but we have $18 billion in additional spending that would be necessary. And considering the Canadian population, that would be close to $500 per capita, if I'm not mistaken. And Chris is not kicking me under the table, so I'm probably approximately right.
Okay, so if Canada were to invest the $18.2 billion shortfall needed to meet the NATO target in 2022-23, would defense spending surpass federal healthcare spending?
I need to look at the healthcare spending, notably the Canada Health Transfer, but I'm not sure if it would be above, but it would certainly, if not above, certainly very close.
It's my understanding it would actually exceed it, the Canada Health Transfer, and we know that our healthcare system is in a state of deep crisis. Too many Canadians don't have a family doctor, suffering because of delayed surgeries or experiencing halfway medicine at overburdened hospitals. Meanwhile, healthcare workers are burning out and some are actually leaving altogether. Now, this year, province has asked for an immediate increase to the Canada Health Transfer of $28 billion. Unfortunately, this year's budget missed that opportunity to provide a lifeline to our healthcare system. For 2022-23, what percentage of Canada's GDP is the federal government spending on healthcare? Is it at least 2%?
Again, I don't know the answer off the top of my head, but I could certainly get back to you with that number.
Do you have a rough idea, like ballpark?
Probably above 2% given the CHT, but if close to 2%, maybe slightly above, ballpark.
Okay, thank you. The 2% NATO target is intended to demonstrate military readiness and political will. If the government were to make significant new defense expenditures, potentially at the expense of other priorities like healthcare, what metrics can track whether Canada is achieving the goal of military readiness?
That's a very difficult question. So the NATO spending target is a spending target. It's not a target or a metric that assesses military readiness. In questions that your colleagues asked prior to yours, they asked what would be a quick way to spend or to reach the 2% target. And Mr. Housefather, who asked that question, he said that would still make sense, but a quick way that would not necessarily make sense would be to increase eligibility for veterans' pensions or significantly increase veterans' pensions, but that would help reaching 2% of GDP on defense, but that would not help in any way for military readiness. So I'm not the best person to assess what's the best metric for military readiness. You need, for that question, you need somebody who's a specialist in military doctrine and military operations. So unfortunately, I cannot answer whether the 2% spending target by NATO is also something that would materially contribute to military readiness. It depends where the spending is directed.
Well, I would have to argue that taking care of our veterans would create better readiness given the labor market shortage we're in and attracting people to the military. So I appreciate your comments. And have you conducted an analysis on what community benefits such as job creation might be expected in Canada, where the government to significantly increase defense spending in the short to medium term to meet the 2% NATO target? And is it possible much of the benefits of such spending would be seen beyond our borders?
So we have not done such a study because we have not made any assumptions as to, so we have not. And to do that, we would need to make certain assumptions as to the mix of spending that would be domestic, for example, on military personnel stationed in Canada versus the proportion of military personnel stationed abroad, as well as the purchase of equipment, the proportion that would be produced and manufactured domestically versus the proportion that would be sourced from foreign countries. So we have not done that study, and it would require a series of assumptions which would be questionable in some instances.
The climate crisis is anticipated to be growing, in terms of a source of geopolitical conflict. What percentage of Canada's GDP is the federal government spending on mitigation and adaptation efforts, both here at home and abroad?
I don't have that number off the top of my head, but it's probably a very small fraction of the amounts that we're talking about today.
Okay, thanks so much. Mr. Chair, how much time?
You have 4 seconds.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sherwood.
Thank you, and Mr. Johns. And that ends our first round, and now we'll go to our second round, and we will start with Mr. Lobb for 5 minutes.
Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon, Mr. Chair. Thank you to Mr. Giroux again for coming to committee. My first question to him was, I know Mr. McCauley touched on the inflation piece, but for 2022, 3, and 4, what inflation rates did you use in your calculation there?
These inflation rates were from the March 2022 Economic and Fiscal Outlook. As for the exact figures, perhaps, I don't have them in front of me.
Okay, no, thank you. Now, just on table 3.3, the expenditure for 22-23 is 36.3 billion. In 2017, we know that NATO agreed to change the calculation, and you note that 7 billion in the increase was just due to that. Is that correct?
More or less. It's actually, without having the data that this committee just passed a motion for us to retrieve, it's hard to break down exactly what makes up that difference. I should also point out that the change that occurred in 2017, this was something that was done at National Defense. It was always allowed, or not always, but it was allowed for a long period of time under NATO guidelines. It's just that the government, I suppose, finally acted on that. At least this is what we suspect, and we will certainly find out more once we receive the data.
Okay. Yeah, because I mean, if you figure out what, well, obviously the Veterans Affairs numbers are public numbers, and the pension and everything else. Would labor, would the wages at Veterans Affairs be calculated in the GDP number?
Yes, they are.
Okay, so wages amongst non-military staff at D&D would also be calculated in this number as well?
Yes, operating expenditures at the Department of Veterans Affairs are also included for the purpose of the NATO definition.
Would the money contributed and the weapons contributed to the Ukrainian effort this year, would that be included in our commitment for the NATO spending?
Yes, these numbers were also included in the definition under the NATO definition.
Okay. Now, I think also the federal government did some matching dollars to the Red Cross. Would that be included in our NATO spending as well?
It's difficult to say. There are elements of transfers from our government to other organizations that are counted, but we don't have a breakdown of that. Thank you.
Okay. Now, say, for example, the United Kingdom and also Poland, I guess those would be two of the more significant countries that actually meet their targets. Was there any analysis done to see, in fact, how they were able to achieve their 2% number?
We looked at the gap between what Canada spends and how much it would need to spend to get to 2%. We did not look at how other countries that have already met or surpassed that target, how they reached that. So that's not something that we looked at.
Okay. Okay. The other one is analysis of delays. And so obviously the F-35 is 2025 potentially. NORAD, we've had some witnesses appear before committee, and some of the stuff they're looking to spend money on is not even in, I guess you could say it's in development, but you certainly couldn't buy it today. What are the risks that, as we move out in a number of years, the percentage of actual equipment is going to decrease and the actual amount of labor spending is going to be a larger percentage as we continue to move forward?
So when there are delays in procurement, there are two big risks. The first risk is that there is amounts that are unspent and that get carried forward and forward. So that may lead to eventually a big amount that remains to be spent after a certain period of time. The other risk when there are delays is that the costs increase, or if the costs don't the costs increase. So these pieces of equipment, these warships or fighter jets, become more expensive because of inflation. And as some of your colleagues have mentioned, there is at times inflation in certain sectors, notably military procurement, that can be higher than general inflation. So the risk of that is cost increases.
Thank you, Mr. Lobb. We'll now go to Mr. Baines for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for coming. I would also like to thank my colleague, for the very important land acknowledgement, and I'd also like to recognize my questions are coming from the traditional territories of the Musqueam and the Coast Salish peoples. My question is on the National Defense reports that it introduced a new funding model, the Capital Investment Fund, in 2017 that allows for flexibility to adapt the annual capital funding levels to align with the actual funding requirements of the projects. Can you describe how this new model works? The question is to
Mr. Very good question. I would think it's best directed to the ministry in question. I have not worked directly with the CIF, or that is the Capital Investment Fund. Thank you.
Okay, and then would the same question be directed to the ministry? How does it help the government pay for complex multi-year projects?
Yes, I think the officials at the Department of National Defense would be in a better position to explain the complex workings of an envelope. As a complement to that, I worked as a public servant in the Department of Finance and the Privy Council Office, and it was always something that was challenging to figure out how much was left in the capital envelope at the Department of National Defense because of the multiple projects that are funded by these envelopes and the regular or frequent reprofiles that complex procurement projects are encountering. So for these reasons, I think the Department of National Defense would be in a better position to answer your question as to how exactly it works.
Okay, can one of you maybe explain how funding could lapse as opposed to funding being reprofiled to future years?
Sure. So that's a lapse is usually an appropriations or an amount of funding that has been approved by Parliament that is not used and expires at the end of the year, whereas a reprofile is an amount of funding that has been approved but for which authority already exists or has been granted to not lose that but reprofile it. So postpone its use to a subsequent year or subsequent years. So that's what we call a reprofile, whereas a lapse is something that does not get used and is lost.
Okay, and then your report mentions that one of the shortcomings of NATO's GDP targets, which assess member states' military capacity, is the ratio will vary based on factors unrelated to defense capacity. For example, inflation, exchange rates, and economic conditions. Is there a way we can account for or otherwise see past these variables when we assess our NATO target spending in the future?
It's true that there are a number of factors, as you mentioned, that can affect the ratio and the overall perception of military readiness. However, having defense spending as a proportion of GDP is probably the easiest way to easily compare countries amongst themselves to get a sense of the order of magnitude of their effort related to defense spending. It is not a perfect metric, of course, because as we have discussed, a country can spend a lot of money on specific areas without making that country's military more efficient or more effective at accomplishing its mission. So for that reason, I think NATO is keen on using defense spending as a share of GDP to compare countries among themselves when it comes to one aspect of military expenditures and effectiveness, but it's by no means the best or the only way to measure military expenditures.
Thank you. That's all the questions I have.
Thank you, Mr. Baines. We will now go to Mrs. Vignola for 2.5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to use my time. I still have some questions for Mr. Giroux, but I have a motion that was tabled. What I would suggest to the committee, so not to cut off the time of my colleagues, I would move that we discuss this motion publicly after the final round of questioning, as we did last week or the week before that. And in this way, we won't be cutting anyone's time. Do I have the committee's approval to do this?
Aware and reminder that we have done precedent where we set that out of respect for those that follow that may have questions and allowed that to happen. I would look around the room, and I'm looking to see that we have consensus to do that. We had it the last time. I just want to make certain we do it. I see heads are nodding yes to that. Okay. Thank you very much. We'll move that to the very end. With that said, Ms. Vignola, you have basically a minute left.
Oh.
But I would suggest that you defer that to when we bring up your motion at the end.
Bien d'accord.
Thank you. We'll go to Mr. Johns for 2.5 minutes.
Okay. Mr. Giroux, if Canada were to invest the $18.2 billion shortfall needed to meet the NATO targets in 2022-23, can you talk about, speak to how that would impact inflationary pressures, and could significant new defense spending exacerbate existing supply and demand and labor market challenges?
So to answer that question, one would need to determine how the spending would be allocated, on what these amounts would be spent. If it's, for example, entirely to increase the number of Canadian Air Force or Canadian Force members, or even civilian personnel that would create wage pressures, not tremendous wage pressures, but it would contribute to labor shortages. On the other hand, if it was to acquire goods or military equipment that is produced abroad, it would have very little inflationary pressures. So the nature or the magnitude of the inflationary pressures that would create depends on the type of spending that would be made with these $18 billion. But if it's all domestic, if it's all personnel, it exacerbates or puts additional pressure on inflation. Same issue if it's with purchase domestically produced goods.
Okay. Now, Mr. Bain, he talked about lapse spending, and back in 2018, Parliament unanimously supported my motion to end all lapse spending for Veterans Affairs. Now, maybe you can speak about the estimate in terms of the likelihood to be that some defense spending allocated to the current fiscal year will be lapsed, and also, we know since 2015 it's typical for some portion of defense spending to be budgeted but not spent. Is lapse funding more common with respect to defense versus other areas of federal spending? I know it's not just the Liberals. I mean, the Conservatives left $1 billion Veterans Affairs alone during their term.
So thank you for the question. So it's not atypical. In fact, it's quite common for departments to lapse money for a variety of factors: unforeseen events, spending that arrives relatively late in the year, decisions that are made in less than a timely manner, or also other factors. And also there's an inherent built-in factor that forces almost departments to have a lapse, is that departments cannot go above their budgets. So managers tend to be prudent and want to avoid going over their spending authorities. With respect to defense, I don't think this year will be any different than previous years, and we anticipate a lapse of similar magnitude to previous years in this year's Department of National Defense spending.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Johns. We'll now go to Mr. Perkins for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. At the time of the announcement of the surface combatant vessels, the NDP Dexter government gave the Irving Shipbuilding a interest-free loan of more than $300 million, which I believe about $260 million was non-repayable. Is that included in this calculation?
In principle, if it accounts for defense spending, it would be included in here. If it's a loan, I don't think that would be included.
The forgivable portion probably would be, though.
Then it would be included, yes.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Chair, as a follow-up, the Irving Shipbuilding recently announced that they would require another $300 million to upgrade the facility at the Irving Shipyard in Halifax for that program. Is that included in this estimate?
Well, it's included to the extent that the government uses existing funding that's already been set aside in the fiscal framework. If, however, the government was to use additional funding, like new spending, then it would not be included, and it would be on top of the amounts that we talk about in our report.
Thank you. Just to change the subject a bit, the Polar Icebreaker project, of which the Parliamentary Budget Officer did a report on in December, is that included in this estimate?
Yes, it is, because it's part of the Coast Guard's capital spending projects.
So if I'm correct, Mr. Chair, in reading through this report, the original $1.3 billion for the vessels is now exceeded a total project of $7.25 billion if the project starts cutting steel next year. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. With respect to our projections, those the major parts of that cost estimate, they come in mostly at the end of this 5-year window, so it doesn't have a huge effect.
Okay. Would the reasons, could you share with us the reasons why that escalation happened that you found?
We actually didn't have, when we requested information from Fisheries and Oceans, they didn't provide us sort of a breakdown of what was in that 1.3 billion estimate at the start. So our exercise was to come up with an independent cost estimate with the project where it was now, rather than to see how did it go from 1.3 to 7.25.
Thank you. So have you planned in your estimate, I think you said if the project is delayed by a year, it will cost another $235 million, and 2 years, $472 million. Have you, in terms of being prudent in the fact that we'll probably be about 10 years into this before we do it, the likelihood of actually getting to that point, have you built that part into your estimate?
We have not, because there's a few ways the government could deal with that. They could keep it a fixed envelope and reduce expenditures on other items to keep the overall expenses whole, or they could decide to replenish the capital envelope for these projects, for defense projects or for the Coast Guard. So we have assumed that it's all within the existing envelope, and as Chris mentioned, it's beyond the 5-year horizon for this report, so it would probably not have been captured had we done it in a different way in this report.
Was there, in any of your studies, have you had the opportunity to look at alternative procurement processes that might be more efficient in comparing what we've done in terms of buying these vessels the way we have?
In our reports, notably on the surface combatants, we looked at alternative designs, not necessarily different ways of procuring the ships, but different designs that were not identical but were comparable and were deemed comparable by other navies across the world. And we found that there are other designs that would be cheaper with smaller ships or ships of slightly different designs. And there are alternatives to the Canadian Surface Combatant, which we mentioned in our report on that project. But off the top of my head, I don't remember all the details.
In terms of looking at this, I thought your report had said that the duplication of the 2 shipyards was one of the major cost factors, which obviously was a political decision and not necessarily a procurement decision. Is that correct?
Well, I won't comment on the decision, what prompted the decision, but it is true that having more than one shipyard build the same type of ship increases costs because there are economies of scale and knowledge gains that cannot be accrued if 2 shipyards build the ships at the same time. But there are other benefits, obviously. Faster
Commissioner Pelche
Thank
of the
you.
Coast Guard
Thank you, Mr.
confirmed you
Perkins.
were right to me.
Thank you. We'll now go to Mr. Kazmierczuk for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you very much, Mr. Giroux, for your testimony today and for providing such excellent responses and really shedding a lot of light on our expenditures, defense expenditures, the last number of years. I know that, our discussions kind of delved into the nitty-gritty right from the get-go in our conversations today, but I just wanted to pull back the microscope a little bit and the lens, and just to get a little bit of context here, in the last 30 years, has spending ever been higher on defense in Canada the last 30 years?
I can certainly speak that since the year 2000, we're higher than we have been at any point since then. And of course, there were some decreases in defense spending during the 90s with the end of the Cold War. So it's safe to say in the last 30 years, we're at a very a higher level, let's say, than at any point previous.
And looking at, for example, the last 5 years of spending and then projecting out, have we ever had a rate of growth in military spending at this rate?
I don't recall offhand if there's been this rapid of an increase. But again, our numbers are predicated on national defense being able to spend according to their capital investment plan under Strong, Secure, Engaged.
There's a lot of assumptions that are based into those calculations, I'm sure. But again, just to reiterate, we've never seen this high rate of growth in terms of increase in the last 30 years. Is it ambitious? Would you call it ambitious?
I don't know about the rate of growth itself, but the level in nominal terms, yes, we haven't seen that. Is it ambitious? I would say it's probably ambitious given the last couple of years of strong, secure, and engage, where the department was not able to spend according to its plan. So to see a further increase in capital spending over the next couple of years is certainly ambitious, but we'll see if it proves to be too ambitious.
Okay, perfect. According to NATO's 31st of March 2022 Defense Expenditure Report, 48% of Canada's budgeted NATO contribution is for personnel, 18% is for equipment, 3% for infrastructure, and 30% is for other spending. What areas of spending could Canada, in your opinion, most readily increase in view of reaching the NATO target? So where do you think is the most opportunity for growth? Is it in personnel, equipment, infrastructure? Just curious.
Well, personnel is difficult to increase quickly if the way to achieve that is more Canadian Forces personnel. Of course, and there's an easy way to increase spending on personnel. It's to increase the salaries and the wages paid to CF personnel, which I'm sure they wouldn't say no to. It would increase the spending, but it wouldn't not necessarily increase the capacities of the CF, of the Canadian Forces. Equipment, there are constraints related to supply. And when it comes to operations, they're constrained by the equipment and the personnel. So one easy way would be to significantly increase veterans' benefits. But again, that would be an increase in spending. I'm not sure it would necessarily be related to a commensurate increase in military capabilities or readiness.
Okay, no, I understand that. The minister made a $4.9 billion announcement in terms of NORAD spending. Do we have a sense at this point how that might impact that balance in terms of how much we spend for personnel, how much for equipment, how much for infrastructure? Do we have a sense from the announcement of how that might change the balance?
Not until we have a breakdown of how the figures are spread out amongst those categories of the $4.9 billion.
Okay, so the details just simply are not there yet for that spending. Okay. According to an April 2022 NATO Association of Canada paper, comparing the value of countries' defense procurement in U.S. dollars is not an accurate assessment of capabilities because it does not account for purchasing power. Can you tell us how we should think about how purchasing power impacts how different countries are investing in military preparedness? And
Sure. So the purchasing power is the concept that refers to the fact that costs are different in different countries. For example, if we compare Canada, which is a well-developed country, to other countries, for example, India and China, where military personnel pay is lower than in Canada, the purchasing power of an equivalent or a US dollar spent in both countries does not buy you the same military capacity. So that's probably what is referred to in the study you quoted. And there's also the effectiveness of the spending itself, how well integrated the different branches of the military are, and the mix of spending between pensions and benefits, personnel, equipment, and infrastructure.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Kazmierczuk, and thank you, Mr. Giroux. And with that, we will go at this point in time, and we are short on time here, and so Mrs. Vignola has a motion that she's already presented. So before we get to that, I'm going to thank Mr. Giroux and Mr. Penny for your attendance once again and coming to us, and appreciate you being here, and thanks again, and I wish you a safe and prosperous summer. And with that, Ms. Vignola, your motion was tabled or basically presented last Friday and was given notice. If you would like to read it, and then we can move from there.
Merci. Merci, Monsieur Giroux.
Thank you, Mr. Giroux and Mr. Penny. The motion reads as follows: that pursuant to Standing Order 1082, the committee undertake a study of the expenditure of nearly $100,000 in public funds for the Governor-General of Canada for catering services during an 8-day tour of the Middle East in March 2022. Can I continue? And that the committee invite the Governor-General to appear before the committee for a period of 2 hours on or before June 23, 2022. That if the Governor-General is unable to appear before the committee itself, she appoint a member of her office who shall have the necessary authority to answer the questions of the members of the committee. So we can't summon the Governor-General. That goes against protocol. I do understand that. That's fine. So the use of the word invitation means that she can or cannot decide to appear, but send in a member to explain the expenditure of public monies that took place for this trip. If I think we're talking about 2 lunches and 2 dinners. So, and this isn't including the hotel or alcohol or anything. So if we're talking about a lot of money, I understand that we're talking about the Governor-General, and I'm very aware of that. But at a time when the public throughout Quebec and Canada have to tighten their belts, and we wind up with 2 bags of groceries that cost $150. Well, this is an expenditure which of taxpayer money, and therefore I think we need to know why. So that we can understand how this money was spent.
Gnola, and I saw some their hands up, and I did see Mr. McCauley, and then Mr. Johns, and then Mr. Housefather. So, Mr. McCauley.
I mostly agree with this. I'm just wondering if perhaps I could offer an amendment that we change the date to September 23rd, because we won't get a meeting in this week, obviously, and just take out from the last line that if the Governor-General is unable to appear before the committee herself, she appoint a member of her office who shall have the necessary authority. Just to delete that, just recognizing we cannot call the GG and just change it to ask her office to appear to discuss the expenses.
Okay, so we have an amendment at this point in time, and we're discussing the amendment.
Point of order, Mr. Chair.
Sorry, Mr. Housefather.
Mr. Chair, I'm so sorry. I didn't realize that you had necessarily accepted the motion, and I would like to raise with you a procedural issue for you to rule on. So I'll leave it to your discretion, but I don't think I can do it unless I do it at the earliest opportunity. And certainly if you agree to an amendment, I can't do that. So I was wondering if you may allow me to do that now.
Just a minute. Thank you. Thank you. So, yes, sorry, Mr. Housefather, on that issue, I will allow you to, on your point of order, to speak to it.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I wanted to raise the fact that this same motion was brought up at the Public Accounts Committee, and the committee ruled it out of order. And in my view, it would be out of order here as well. It's been made clear from all the different media reports and the response from the Department of National Defense that the Department of National Defense was the one responsible for the catering on the Governor General's planes, that she had nothing whatsoever and her office had nothing whatsoever to do with it, that the decision on catering services was made by the Royal Canadian Air Force. And under the mandate of the National Defense Committee, it has the mandate to study all matters pertaining to the Royal Canadian Air Force, which we do not. The appropriate people to ask about this, and I think we all agree, excessive catering bill, which I believe was 80,000 as opposed to 100,000, would be the representatives of the Department of National Defense, not the Governor General. And as such, Mr. Chair, I would humbly request you to consider that this motion is not appropriate before our committee, it's appropriate before the Defense Committee, and to rule it out of order.
Thank you, Mr. Housefather. And I know when in your response to you, when we first received the motion, there were some concerns about it when it was read. It is understood that, and as Ms. Vignola has pointed out, is that we can't compel the Governor General to come to committee. With that said, the Office of the Governor General does fall under the parameters of the OGO and government operation estimates. And in fact, we voted on estimates, and we have continued to vote on estimates on the Office of the Governor General. As well as historically, it has happened where the Governor General has, or the Governor General's office has appeared, granted in years gone by, but it has appeared before OGO in the past. And so after seeing that and ruling, I did rule and do rule that this motion is in order.
Mr. Chair, may I challenge your ruling then, please?
Okay. Yes. With the challenge, then it's a non-debatable challenge, and basically you are challenging, and so the vote will be, and I'll ask the clerk to speak to that.
So the motion is that the chair's ruling be sustained. And I'll call the vote. Mr. Baines. Mr. Bain.
Sorry, mute. I vote no.
Mr. Housefather.
No.
Mr. Johari.
Against.
Mr. Kuzmerchuk.
No.
Ms. Thompson.
I vote no.
Mr. Loeb.
I vote yes.
Mr. Macaulay.
Yes, please.
Mr. Perkins.
Yes.
Madame Vignola.
Oui.
And Mr. Johns.
Yes.
So wait, don't go yet. No, you don't have to. You don't have to. You don't have to break it for a challenge to the chair. You probably.
So we will now, at this point in time, entertain the amendment by Mr. Macaulay. Discussion of the amendment. I see Mr. Johns' hands up, and then Mrs. Vignola.
Sure. So thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Ms. Vignola, for putting this motion forward. I think it's an excellent motion to get some accountability. It's a reckless amount of money that's been spent on this trip, and it needs some accountability, and we need better transparency. The only concern is, and I do share Mr. Housefather's rationale that all the media is saying that this falls under DND. However, if the chair is consulted prior, that's why I supported the decision on the vote. However, Mr. Macaulay put forward an amendment for September 23rd, which I think is reasonable. Gives us time to come back in the fall and to have a witness. But I do think it should not. We should amend it so it doesn't read that it's Governor General. It should be, someone from DND. that should be testifying at OGO. I don't believe that we can. First, we don't have the power to summon the Governor General to the committee, and that we should be requesting someone from DND who is responsible for travel for the Governor General testify before the committee to explain themselves. So that would be the change that I think we should make, and I'd love to hear more from my colleagues.
Thank you, Mr. Johns. And just to be clear, the amendment that was put forward is that the public, it's the Office of the Governor General and not the Governor General, just to be clear, and that was what the amendment stated. But Mrs. Vignola.
Thank you very much. I agree with the Mr. McCauley's suggestion so that the motion will be made simpler. I think that Mr. Gord wants to add something, that we add a member from the National Defense. So it's an amendment to the amendment. Secondly, I would like my colleagues, when they have an opportunity to go visit our committee site, that explains the mandate of our committee and says clearly that that our mandate is to look at the following organizations and to conduct studies. And if we look at the list, we can see the Office of the Governor General. So we can question the office. This is part and parcel of our mandate. This is a lot of money. We all agree with it. So if we need to make an amendment to the amendment, let's do it. I have no problem with defense coming, but at one point, somebody said yes to this, to lunches and dinners that are $350 per person. That's a huge amount of money. I don't pay for something that I don't pay that much for someone. I don't know anybody here who would. And we're not even talking about alcohol. Someone somewhere said, that's a good idea. And somebody else said, go for it. Let's go. It's going to be great. So we have to ask ourselves a question. I do understand she's a Queen's representative, the Governor General, all that, but still, are we going to accept all of that? To see our money spent like that? If you want to add someone else from the Department of National Defense, I have nothing against the decision, no problem. But the Office of the Governor General, perfect. I fully agree with what Mr. McCauley proposed. I always work on a consensual basis. I will continue to do so. But geez, we're talking about $80,000. And that doesn't even touch on the rest of the expenditures. I don't know if I'm the only one who finds this just exorbitant, too much. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Vignola. And to Mr. Housefather.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And to respond to Ms. Vignola, we all find this excessive. That's not the issue. The question is, who's responsible for this and which committee is responsible for looking into this? In my opinion, it's not the Office of the General Governor who was responsible. It was Defense. So it's Defense that should be accountable and answer that question. But this committee has determined that we should keep this matter to our as part of our mandate. And who approved these expenditures? It's not the Governor General. In my opinion, I think we should change the amendment.
What I was saying is that I think we all find this excessive. I think we all find it absurd that meals of this amount were charged, and that somebody should certainly look into it. The reason I raised that was because the Governor General's office has made clear they had nothing to do with it, that it was the Department of Defense and the Royal Canadian Air Force. So to me, it would have been the Defense Committee that would have been the most appropriate to study it. But if we want to study it, the people we should be calling are not the Governor General's office, it's the Department of Defense. So I would like to sub-amend Mr. Macaulay's amendment to change the word the Office of the Governor General to a representative of the Department of National Defense.
Yeah.
So, sorry, Mr. Johns has sort of moved a sub-amendment to add the
Not add,
D&D.
Mr. Chair.
Sorry?
Mr. Chair, out of respect, Mr. Johns didn't actually propose a sub-amendment. He said he wanted to hear from his colleagues. I've proposed a sub-amendment, which is to strike the words, the Office of the Governor General, from Mr. Macaulay's amendment, and to replace it with a representative of the Department of National Defense.
Okay, so right now we're on discussion of the sub-amendment as proposed by Mr. Housefather. And I've got hands all over the place, and I'm going to go with Mr. Johns first, then Mr. Lobb, and then Mr. Perkins.
This makes sense to me because what we're hearing and learning is that it is defense that's in charge. So they're the ones that need to be before our committee and accountable. And I guess it's one half dozen of the other, whether it's at defense or whether it's here. But having defense come and appear before us, we're going to be able to ask questions and probably make some recommendations from that. But I don't believe that the Governor General staff have anything to do with it. So that's what the media is saying, and that's what we're hearing from all the research we've done as well. So let's get the right people here. I don't want to play politics. I just want to get the answers, and I want to do it right, and I don't want to be disrespectful. So let's get D&D here. That's I support this amendment. I think it's the right way to go, and we're absolutely all appalled by what took place overall.
Thank you, Mr. Johns. And to be clear, we're talking about a sub-amendment to change from the Office of the Governor General to Department of National Defense. And with that, I will go to Mr. Lobb, then Mr. Perkins, and then Ms. Vignola.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chair. And I think we should just get on with this and make a decision. It was for the Governor General. It wasn't for a general or anybody else. So this isn't the Governor General's office first rodeo. They certainly have many years of experience with these things, and to just say let's just go ahead and whatever it is, you'll just surprise us. We didn't have any idea. I think that's a bad defense. If you want to include both offices, I would be open to that. You could have military and the Governor General's office if you want as well. But if the same thing had happened to the Prime Minister, doesn't matter what political party is. You say, well, I don't know. It's not my fault. These guys did it. Well, no, it was for you, and it was your responsibility. And I think we all carry those same responsibilities. So I leave it at that. Again, this isn't till September, so things might change. Maybe it gets resolved anyhow. So I just say let's move on here.
Thank you, Mr. Lobb. Mr. Perkins.
Monsieur Perkins. Merci, Monsieur le Président. Je crois que les deux bureaux y ont joué un rôle.
Ms. Perkins, because we have the French translation on the English, so if we can just correct that. If you want to start again, Mr. Perkins.
Are we okay now? Yeah. Yes. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I actually think it's not either or. I think it's both. Mr. John's motion, or Mr. Housefather's motion is to focus on D&D rather than the Governor General. I can know in a past life when I worked for a minister, I've booked Challenger jets and I've booked the larger jet as well, and the office of the minister is involved in the discussion about what food is provided, and of course in this case there was also, I believe, alcohol involved, and D&D does not handle alcohol, so the Governor General's office would have been involved in those decisions about the alcohol that was served. So I think the D&D, manages the plane, they provide the pilots, they do all that logistics, they serve the food, but the choices usually of what happens on the plane, what food and beverages are served on the plane, are that of the office that is booking. So I think there is probably a bit of responsibility on both sides of both DND and the Office of the Governor General. So I would fear that with the amendment that's on this, that we'd be only getting a small part of the story and missing the ultimate accountability, which is the Office of the Governor General, who would have approved whatever was proposed for that plane.
Thank you, Mr. Perkins. We'll now go to Ms. Vignola.
I agree that we should add the Department of National Defense to the motion so we get to the bottom of things. But I can't believe that Defense is the one that decides that the Governor General will eat this and this, and she doesn't even have a word to say about her own menu. If she's the Queen's representative, I can't see the Queen not having her say as to what she's going to eat, what's sitting on her dish. So I think this is a shared responsibility, and I'm open to the idea that we meet with the officials who are involved on both sides. And if we see that one side isn't really involved, well, that will shed some light on the situation. And it's a problem we're dealing with. It's a problem. There are two groups involved in this event, and they don't talk to each other. And because of this lack of communication, expenditures are made, which from my point of view as a citizen, who've had to go to food banks in the past, these expenditures are more than just being exaggerated. At least this study will enable us to show the importance, in particular, that we talk to each other and that we stop working in silos. It's important. We're talking about the public's money. And as I said, for someone who's already had to go to a food bank, I'm holding back because there are certain things I could say which are typically from Quebec, that I feel like saying. It's insulting, at the very least. So I do agree that we should add the Department of National Defense, but that we also talk to the Office of the Governor General to have a complete understanding of the decision-making process that led to this expenditure. Thank you.
And I see Mr. Housefather.
Yes, Mr. Chair, I wish to respond to Mr. Perkins and note that I'm calling him by his correct name.
I apologize, Mr. Housefather.
Yeah. Where he brought up the subject of alcohol, it's very clear from the order paper answer to Mr. Barrett that the catering costs include the cost of food, non-alcoholic beverages, and associated fees, including catering, handling and delivery, storage, cleaning, disposal of international waste, airport taxes, administrative fees, security charges, and local taxes. So there's no alcohol that was included in those costs. The second thing is I want to draw the committee's attention again to the statement from Rideau Hall, where it says that the Governor General shares the public's concerns in relation to the expenses and points out the fact that it's DND that is responsible and not her office. So again, I fail to see the benefit of calling the Governor General or her office when it's clear there's another group responsible. If indeed, again, if this committee hears from DND and the RCAF and we hear that they say to us, no, the Governor General was involved, or the Governor General's office had a hand in deciding on the meals and knew the costs or whatever else, the committee can then call the Governor General's office. But at this point, I don't think we have a basis to do that because they've said they had nothing to do with it. And I just don't think it's fair to call people that have said they had nothing to do with the decision when we can call the people that did. So anyways, that's my point, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Housefather. And Mr. Doherty.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity to come in and weigh in on this. I, as many others, were dismayed when we read the reports of the costs associated with those flights. And I take what my friend, Mr. Housefather, is saying, but I also know that as members of Parliament, we are put into a place to hold those in higher offices also account and to find out those questions that our electors have. Canadians want to know. Canadians are going through some very troubling times, very difficult times in the last couple of years, and to see a bill such as what we see, two bills such as what was reported in the media, reflects poorly on all of us, Liberals, Conservatives, Bloc, Green, all of us that are elected officials. And it also diminishes the trust that Canadians have in us as elected officials that we can manage taxpayers' money. Once again, I'll remind those that are around this table that it is not our money, it is taxpayers' money. And my understanding is that the sub-amendment that is being proposed is to leave off the Governor General. The Governor General is amongst the highest office in this land, and we should have, but is not above scrutiny as well. We should have the Governor General to come to answer this. If it is indeed her testimony that she had nothing to do with it, so be it. But she should appear before this committee to have those words, and so that the committee can question, using their authority as a parliamentary committee, to look into these matters, the matters that matter most to Canadians. I believe that it is fully appropriate to have the Governor General appear before this committee, as well as the RCAF and the DND. And Mr. Chair, I'll leave it at that. I think it's important once again to do this. I've already stated that I think that there's a number of things that diminish the trust of Canadians and in what we do as parliamentarians and as leaders of this country. 338 members of Parliament elected to be the voices and to be the eyes and ears for Canadians. I think it's imperative that this committee does the job, the just job that they have been selected to do.
Thank you, Mr. Mr. Doherty. I apologize. Okay, I'm looking around the room to see if there's any further discussion, and I'm not seeing any at this point in time. So with that said, we will go to sorry, what's that? Yes. So we no hands are up. We will. Sorry, Mr. Perkins.
I'm just wondering in this discussion, and I appreciate what all the members have said on both sides, if there's an ability to find a compromise between the proposed sub-amendment and what the mover of the main amendment is putting, because I think the mere fact that we have perhaps a bit of, won't call it confusion, but a little bit of uncertainty as to where the actual lines are drawn and how this happens, and whether, if DND is responsible for everything, then it would be, I think, advantageous and beneficial to hear from the Office of the Governor General that we have and understand their process in the booking of the flights and how all of that works in the relationship between the two entities. And And having some transparency and clarity for the sake of taxpayers into this whole process and how it works obviously is about the Governor General, but I'm sure it reflects on how all of the executive fleet is used when booked by government officials, and having some understanding of the relationship between those who book and the choices that are offered to them and how they get made and who is responsible for actually executing it. Is it a series, for example, on food of menu options with prices that are given that the office that is booking is considering, or is it, as seems to be the implication, that people in the Department of National Defence just choose for those who are the client, essentially, whether it's the Prime Minister or the Governor General or others, that they just accept whatever is given at whatever price? I would think those on the other end who are booking the facilities would want to understand the cost structures of the flight that they're embarking on, and each of the people who come onto the plane with them, and what the cost per person is going forward, to understand what amount of taxpayer dollars are being used and spent in the effort to do whatever it is that they are venturing to do on this travel, whether it's within Canada or whether it's abroad. And perhaps if they don't know that, it's an area for the committee to take a bit of a look at in terms of the transparency, because I think obviously something would need to be changed as a recommendation of this committee at taking a look at it, because the decisions about how many people travel and how many people come on the aircraft might actually change with regard to the thoughts of those booking if they understood the value or the cost of each individual. I would hope it would anyway, that the individual would be looking at that and saying, you know, in this case, well, that's going to be an $80,000 case if you add up all the bits and pieces, and perhaps we should be aware of that and be more conscious of that, and ask DND back if there are less exorbitant ways to achieve the same thing in terms of the choices that are being made. I find it difficult to believe. Again, you know, things may have changed since I was a ministerial assistant way back when I had a lot more hair. That we were aware of those choices and part of that decision-making process. So it's, I think, critical for all of our accountability, as Mr. Doherty outlined, to make sure that, I assume that's the primary purpose of this committee, is to make sure that we're getting value for taxpayer money, and that all those who are benefiting from the support of the taxpayer in the jobs that we do or they do going forward are very conscious every time that we are just people holding an office, and others will come after us to hold those same offices, and that we have the highest of regard for the choices we make, and we're not here to, you know, live an exorbitant life off of the taxpayer, particularly when we travel, and that part of it and understanding the relationship would be extremely helpful. So I would ask if the mover, I guess, of the sub-amendment would consider having it perhaps more as a friendly amendment that would see both those areas, the Office of the Governor General, obviously not the Governor General herself, because we can't call the sovereign or the representative of the sovereign before Parliament in that way. Kings have lost their heads over that. But the office, obviously, the people are making these decisions, and I have no doubt that the Governor General herself was totally unaware of this, and that we have both of those organizations put before us to get the clarity. And I'm perfectly willing to hear the answer, of course, that the Governor General, for the record, and the office had absolutely no role. I think that would be an an interesting understanding of the relationship to have. So thank you very much in terms of the consideration. So I'm just wondering if the member, Mr. Housefather, would consider putting that as a friendly amendment to combine with the office of the Governor General in that. So I'll just leave it there and pose that question, whether or not the member wants to address it. Obviously, it's up to him.
Thank you, Mr. Perkins. I see Mr. Doherty's hand is up.
Yeah, really briefly, Mr. Chair, and again, I appreciate the intervention by Mr. Perkins and as well as Mr. Housefather. And I will remind our colleagues that we all travel to get to Ottawa. It was back in 2019, and my good friend, Mr. Johns, who I believe is on this this committee, he and I have amongst the highest travel that parliamentarians have. It was back in 2019 that it was, we're always under scrutiny about our travel claims and the travel that we have, and it is for us to answer to. And as the Governor General is the Commander in Chief for our Royal Canadian Armed Forces, she is amongst the highest for that. She is in charge of this, and she needs to answer to it. And as such, I know that all the colleagues travel to get to Ottawa extensively, but I would have to say that Mr. Johns and I and maybe some others from the West probably have amongst the highest travel costs. And so that we know the scrutiny that we are put under on an annual basis for that travel, but it is imperative and we have to answer to it. And I think no different for the Governor General. She needs to be able to come to this committee and actually explain these bills. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Doherty. Mr. Johns. Mr. Johns, you're on mute.
Yeah, I appreciate that comment by my colleague. I had the lowest travel out of all BC MPs, and it was a lot of work to do that. I flew in economy, and I was really frivolous and looking for the cheapest flights possible to save taxpayers money. So we are accountable. I do believe, though, that we need to start. Like we can start somewhere here at this committee. We don't have to go straight to the Governor General. Let's find out from DND and from her staff, first, who makes the decisions? We can ask that. What oversight does the Governor General have over her travel in office and decision making when it relates to DND making decisions like this? I believe that would be the right place to start. I'm not saying, Mr. Doherty, I know you're shaking your head, but I'm not afraid to go there. I'm just saying, I think starting somewhere, the beginning, having someone from her office attend and someone from DND, and I think Ms. Vignola, you can appreciate this too, just getting some understanding of what are the procedures, what are the protocols, what kind of oversight exists. I think that would be something basics that we could start with, and I'm not saying we don't need to expand it, but let's start with ensuring that we get the right information, and I still believe DND could have provided all of that. That would have been the right place to go, since they're the ones with the authority of all of the catering and all of the planning around those flights. But I mean, they're under oath. They're not going to lie to us. I mean, we get DND to committee. They're going to explain the process and how the process works, and then we can continue to invite witnesses. Nothing precludes us in this committee from demanding we go further into an investigation around something like this.
Thank you, Mr. Johns. Mr. Housefather.
Mr. Chair, I'm listening to my colleagues, and while I find honestly that this should be DND that answers for their own decisions, if the willingness is by the other people in the committee to invite somebody from DND, particularly the Royal Canadian Air Force, to come to committee together with a representative of the Governor General's office, not her, but a representative of her office, I'm fine with varying my amendment to say, instead of striking the office of the Governor General, to say a representative of the office of the Governor General and a representative of the RCAF from the Department of National Defense or whatever to come. But it's clear that the RCAF, the Department of Defense, is the one that can provide answers, not the Governor General's office. And if the committee wants to have them here, I'm not going to block that. I just think that we have to have the people who can really answer the questions. So I'm willing to listen to my colleagues and change the sub amendment, if you allow, Mr. Chair, to say instead of striking, to add the words and a representative from the Department of National Defense. And I know I probably need to get unanimous consent to withdraw it and to put it back, but if there's consensus, maybe, Mr. Chair, you can just allow it.
Thank you, and I was just about to touch on that issue. I'm going to look around the room and see if there's consensus to make that change, and I'm seeing thumbs up all around the room, and that is great. So with that said, I'm going to ask the clerk to call the vote on the sub-amendment.
On the sub-amendment of Mr. Housefather, Mr. Bain,
I vote yes.
Mr. Housefather,
Yes.
Mr. Johari,
Yes.
Mr. Kuzmerchuk,
Yes.
Ms. Thompson,
Yes.
Mr. Loeb,
Yes.
Mr. Lobb.
Can you hear me?
Oh, yes, now I can.
Sorry. Yes. Vote yes.
Mr. McCauley.
Yes, please.
Mr. Perkins.
Yes.
Madame Vignola.
Oui.
And Mr. Johns. Oh.
Okay,
Mr. Johns.
Okay.
I
So it's
see.
carried. Now, with that said, we're running out of very quick time, so we have to go very quickly. So we will now vote on the amendment with this as sub-amended, and we'll vote for the amendment.
Amendment, do you want to see if you have agreement?
Pardon?
Do you want to see if you have, you might have unanimous here.
I'm looking around. Do we have unanimous consent? Yes, I'm seeing unanimous consent for the amendment as, and now that's carried, and now the motion as amended. And I'm seeing consent around the room. Yes, carried. Thank you very much, everybody. We managed to do this, and I want to thank the interpreters and the technicians and everybody for allowing us to go longer than we did. It's greatly appreciated. I want to thank you all and wish you all a very exciting and enlightening time over the summer with your family. And on behalf of the committee, thank you, everybody, for everything. And with that, we're adjourned.
you.